Back in 2013, Frozen exploded onto the scene, with its signature song Let It Go topping all the song charts and driving parents everywhere crazy. The characters, songs, and movie in general were everywhere, to the point where you had to have been living under a rock or stranded on a deserted island not to have heard of this movie. But as a result, that caused the movie to be hated by some for exactly that reason, with many arguing that it wasn't nearly as good as its reputation warranted. And so today, you've got many different schools of thought on the subject, with some maintaining it was a masterpiece, with others saying it was an overhyped mess, others saying it was good but flawed, others saying that it wasn't great but had good moments, and so forth. Well, with the benefit of almost 10 years hindsight, today I would like to revisit this movie and try to answer whether or not this actually was a well-written movie and whether or not it lived up to its original hype. Now, before we get started, please understand that I'm going to try to be as impartial as possible, but I might still throw my 2 cents in every once in a while. And I also won't be taking anything from the sequel into account, as I want to explore the original movie as its own entity, as well as its initial reception in 2013 and if it was deserved. And needless to say, there are spoilers ahead. So I guess the two questions to ask are, is Frozen actually well written, and did it live up to the insane hype it was given? Now, to start to answer those two questions, I feel we must first explore what audiences were expecting when they initially went to see the movie back in 2013. And while the Disney company was considered to have improved since its rut in the 2000s, I don't think many were expecting much more than your run-of-the-mill Disney princess movie, with probably most believing it would be something similar to Tangled, and that wouldn't have been an unfair assumption to make. But the thing was, Frozen wasn't like Tangled. In fact, it wasn't like anything the company had ever made before. Now, I know this phrase has become extremely controversial in the past few years, but what I believe Frozen did was subvert the audience's expectations. In fact, I think this might just be one of the best examples of how to subvert expectations out there. As a wise fellow YouTuber, Savage Books, said, when you want to try something new with a long-established formula, you've got to mix that old formula with new elements. And if you ask me, that's exactly what Frozen does. It has all the markings, all the setups of a Disney princess movie, but then spins most of the tropes on their head. Instead of having two happy-go-lucky princesses, neither of them are particularly happy, with one suffering from major psychological trauma on a level of realism not seen since The Lion King. And instead of having the love interest being a prince or some other important figure, Kristoff is just a simple man who takes active pride in the fact that he lives more like a reindeer than an actual person. The entire conflict, instead of being caused by a central villain, is just a random series of events being quickly stacked on top of each other by the character's actions, almost making those events feel more realistic as a result. And finally, the prince figure that would be the hero of any other story turns out to be a complete sociopath, betraying the trust of both the characters and the audience, who completely trusted him to be a beacon of help and hope in a sea of increasingly desperate chaos. Especially since they made it look like they were going to go the same route as Enchanted by the time the fateful kiss comes. Admit it, you thought that's what they were going for. And finally, the day is saved not through romantic love, but through a love only siblings can have. However, as I mentioned earlier, Frozen has plenty of familiar elements any Disney fan would know. The princesses, and Anna in particular, are still good people and have their more plucky moments Disney princesses are known for. It's also a musical, as keeping with traditional Disney movies, contains magical elements and creatures, and has animal and non-human sidekicks that contribute to the plot a lot more than one might initially assume. There's plenty of action, chases, and the stakes become appropriately high for a Disney adapted fairy tale. And even if it is a slightly different kind, love still does ultimately save the day, and the main characters get a happy ending they deserve and that anybody would expect from Disney. Now, you might be thinking, what is my point with all of this? That by perfectly blending these new and old elements together, Disney crafted a film that at once feels like a Disney movie, but also feels completely different at the same time. And the result was something that the audience never expected and caused them to come out of the theaters in droves screaming that it was the best thing they'd ever seen simply because it managed to mix the two so well. Elsa was hailed as a revolutionary character just because she was the first Disney princess to be portrayed with psychological trauma, even though she actually has a lot of similarities to Simba in The Lion King. But of course, we also can't forget that everybody loved the soundtrack, but that mostly came down to writing a good song for such a subversive film. Let It Go would have been popular no matter what movie it was released in, as long as the singer was the same and the context surrounding it was even vaguely similar. But combining it with a film that stunned the audience so much led to the hype quickly shooting through the roof. Now, the question is whether or not the actual movie lives up to that hype. But before I can really answer that question, I think the other one must be answered first. Is Frozen an objectively well-written film? Now, as I've said before, I don't claim to be an expert on these matters, but if you're willing to take the word of an amateur writer, I would honestly say yes. I mean, it isn't the greatest film of all time, it does have some flaws, but on the whole, for what it sets out to do, I think it does it very well. For having such a troubled production, I don't think I've ever seen a movie that knows what it wants to be so well. The theme of sisterhood and the bond between them is so well represented, and everything in the movie on a symbolic level either somehow ties back to that or Anna and Elsa themselves. Every action and important object has some kind of meaning or symbolism to it. Throwaway lines turn out to be extremely important and significant later on, and sometimes in rather subtle ways. In fact, I'm even tempted to say that this movie should be honestly shown in film schools to show exactly how you tie themes and symbolic representations into a story. That's how good they did it. I also think it's got a good plot, even if it does seem to be a little random at times. But as I said before, that's what I think makes it good in this case. Real life doesn't follow a plot structure, so for the characters to be constantly changing their end goals and courses of action almost makes it feel more realistic because it's more likely to happen that way in real life. And moreover, I think the characters are written just fine, especially in regards to their role in the plot, as well as the writers going out of their way to make Elsa sympathetic and emphasizing that she doesn't want to hurt anybody. Now, I know there are some that have accused Elsa of trying to run away from her problems, but the thing is, I don't think those people are really looking at it from her perspective. I mean, I think the film makes it clear that she sees herself as the problem. Now, obviously the real issue is that she doesn't know how to control her powers, but she doesn't believe she can, and will inevitably hurt or even kill somebody if she's around other people. So from her perspective, isolating herself isn't running away from the problem, it's fixing the problem. And this is made even clearer when Anna tries to reason with her, as up to that point Elsa had actually embraced and had control over her powers for the first time. But the second somebody, especially somebody she cares about so much, shows up, her anxiety kicks in, and her powers go out of control again. So of course she's going to believe that being alone is her only solution. As flawed as her logic is, she genuinely believes that total isolation is the only way to fix her problems and keep everybody else safe from her. And it isn't until Anna literally puts her life on the line for her that she realizes there are other alternatives, at which point she takes them. Honestly, once again, it's all actually pretty well thought out. And then, of course, there's the issue of Hans. Now, I know I'd said this in a previous video, but I think that was actually a good move on the writer's part, and certainly a bold one at that. But from a writer's perspective, was it the right one? Well, personally, if it had been me, I might have put in a little more foreshadowing, but I still feel that there are plenty of little, barely noticeable hints to his true intentions. which does help show that the writers intended him to be that way from the start. I mean, I know that scene with the rowboat is misleading, but it's not impossible he could be thinking, huh, that went even better than I expected, which causes him to have a genuine smile instead of a typical evil one. But I will admit, as a writer, I probably wouldn't have put that in. But nevertheless, he does end up driving home the point that you can't trust strangers, even ones that embody chivalrous and noble stereotypes. And I also think he adds a much needed level of stakes to the climax, giving the heroes a tangible force to work against and leading to a peaceful resolution once he's been stopped. As I said before, he's perfectly placed into the plot, seeming to be a helpful friend who turns on them exactly when the movie needs a villain, making the climax even worse, desperate, and hopeless as a result of his betrayal. It's like, even though you know this is a Disney movie, when he closes that door and orders Elsa's execution, it feels like he's played his cards so perfectly, you feel he can't possibly lose until Olaf opens that door. And even then, he still comes seconds away from winning. Let me put it to you this way. You don't know how many people I've heard say they literally shouted at the screen in the movie theater after Hans turns on Anna. And I'm not talking about kids here, but fully grown adults, some of whom even admitted they yelled obscenities even though they knew there were children there. And you have to admit, whether it was because they trusted him so much or had grown to like Anna, the writers had to have done something right to evoke such a strong reaction from the audience, especially considering he went on to be cited as one of Disney's most hated villains almost immediately afterwards. And you don't get those kind of results unless you've got a pretty good script on your hands. Now, as I've said, personally I think Hans could have been written a little better, but even as is, he fills his role in the story very well, and the plot twist certainly got the reaction they had intended him to have. Now, before I reach my final verdict, I feel there's one other thing that should be addressed. Mainly, Frozen's subversive nature that made it a smash hit in the first place. Now, I know there are many aspects of it that I had criticized in my Pixar Problems series, but the thing is, those aspects work here. I'll admit that. But what Disney didn't realize is, these aspects were only going to work once. You could only pull off something like Hans and get away with it once. You could only portray things so realistically in a children's movie once. If you keep doing it in subsequent movies, it's not subversive anymore because the audience is expecting it. But instead, they took these aspects in Frozen and cranked them all the way up for their subsequent movies, while also forgetting to use and respect the old formula as well, leading to movies that either tried too hard to mix old and new, or even just stomped on the old without paying it proper respect, being way too mature in nature, and having a bunch of twist villains that either didn't have any foreshadowing or properly fill their role in the story. Now, as I myself argued, these problems did exist way before Frozen came out, but it seems these elements really went out of control after this movie's insane success, with the lesson Disney seemed to learn being copy the new things Frozen did and it'll always work out, instead of trying something new is okay as long as you've got a good script that pays proper respect to the old Disney formula. So as a result, some people have come to hate Frozen not because they believe it's a bad movie, but because of what they believe it did to subsequent Disney movies. And while I would say that's not an unfair opinion to have, I would still also say that it's more Disney's fault rather than the movies because they failed to understand what made it so appealing in the first place. Okay, so to finally answer the question, did Frozen live up to the hype it was given? Honestly, I would have to say no, but only because it was hyped to be so big that only the greatest movies ever could have lived up to it. And in reality, all it did was subvert normal Disney expectations, but was otherwise just a standard good movie. As a result, it got glorified by one half of the fandom and trashed by the other who could see past the glamour of the subversion and see the movie for what it actually was. And as a result, to them, it not only didn't live up to the hype, but was a bad movie and overrated because of it. So, if anything, I would say its hyped up nature actually did more harm than good for it in the long run, as it led to it having a somewhat divisive nature, which only got worse when people also accused it of hampering future movies. So, no, I would say it didn't live up to the hype, but only because it never should have been hyped up like that in the first place. Now, as for whether it was a well written movie, I think you all know what I'm going to say already, which is yes. To keep it short, so I don't repeat myself, I think it's got a very solid foundation and good characters with themes and a plot that knows exactly what it wants to be. At the end of the day, I believe Frozen is a rather good and enjoyable movie that had the misfortune of becoming much more popular than it was ever supposed to be, leading many to only see the best or worst of it, which is why it's seen as a more divisive movie these days. But I honestly believe that if everybody just took a step back and tried to look at it objectively, without the hype and without what followed, they might just find that the movie would probably stand up against normal levels of scrutiny. Alright, that's really all I've got in terms of that. So what do you think? Do you think Frozen is well written or not? And do you think it should have been hyped up the way it was? Please feel free to let me know in the comments. And remember, if you disagree with me, that's fine. I'm just trying to start a discussion here, and you are free to have your own opinions on the topic. Thank you all for watching. It is very greatly appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.